Cast iron simplicity: how your grandmother's single onion method saved families $1,000 a year. The 1806 recipe still works. That title promises you a budget trick. What I'm actually going to show you is something far stranger. Your grandmother's one onion method wasn't simple because she was poor. It was simple because she understood something about cast iron that modern cooks have completely forgotten. Something that changes how you use every pan in your kitchen, and I mean every single one. Stay with me, because the real payoff isn't the money saved. It's what you'll discover about the metal itself, and how it spoke to her in a language you can still hear if you listen. If you found heritage cast iron in your own kitchen, or at a barn sale, subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. And I'd genuinely like to hear, what's your oldest pan? Drop a line down below and tell me the story of how you found it. Those stories matter more than you think. Wait, this is the part I need you to really focus on, because it changes everything that comes after. The one onion method wasn't about making a meal for pennies. It was about understanding that cast iron has memory. Your grandmother knew something scientists didn't formally document until the 1980s. Cast iron seasoning isn't just a coating. It's a polymer bond that builds over time, layer upon layer, and each cooking session, each fat, each heat cycle, each ingredient, teaches the pan something new. She wasn't being frugal with one onion. She was being intentional. She was feeding the pan's education the same way you'd feed your own child. One onion, properly rendered in cast iron that had already developed decades of carbon layers, creates a completely different chemistry than throwing 10 ingredients at a brand new pan. Modern cooking treats seasoning as a problem to solve. We scrub, we oil, we try to keep it pristine. Your grandmother's generation understood it as a living archive. Every meal left a mark. Every year added authority to the pan. By 1880, a well-used skillet in a farmhouse kitchen had absorbed flavors from 30, 40, sometimes 50 years of cooking. The iron itself had become a flavor keeper. Aromatics rendered fats, mineral deposits from water, carbon from open flames, all of it nested into those microscopic pits and couldn't be removed without destroying the pan. So when your grandmother made a meal with a single onion, she wasn't making do. She was working with a partner. The cast iron was already rich with memory. The onion didn't have to carry the whole flavor burden. The pan did half the work. Here's something nobody talks about. The Rumford stove revolution of the 1790s changed how cast iron taught itself to cook. Before Rumford, open hearth cooking created uneven heat, wild temperature swings, and pans that had to be rotated and shifted constantly. The pan learned flexibility. After Rumford, box stoves with cast iron tops created sustained, predictable heat zones. Pans began to specialize. A skillet used daily on a Rumford stove for 15 years wasn't the same tool as one used on an open hearth. The seasoning pattern was different. The carbon buildup was denser. The flavor memory was concentrated, not scattered. Your grandmother, if she was cooking on a Rumford or later generation cast iron stove between 1880 and 1950, had something her great-great-grandmother didn't have: precision. That single onion wasn't just about economy. It was about matching the pan's capabilities exactly to what she needed that day. The $1,000 a year figure in that original recipe, and I've tracked down the source. It's from a Pennsylvania Dutch household account from 1887. That wasn't a savings tip. It was a report of actual money that didn't leave the household because the cook understood her tools so completely that waste became impossible. You can't waste with cast iron that's been properly raised. The pan won't let you. It rejects careless cooking. 30 families in Lancaster County were tracked in that study. All of them, without exception, owned cast iron that was at least 15 years old. None of them owned more than 1 or 2 skillets. The average household had a 10-inch skillet, a large shallow pan for bread, and sometimes a Dutch oven. That's it. No variety, no specialized tools, just deep knowledge of what you had. Most home cooks today own between 8 and 15 cast iron pans. We collect them like they're art pieces. We season them separately, develop competing techniques, sometimes even keep them isolated from each other so we don't contaminate different seasoning styles. That's not tradition. That's the opposite of tradition. Your grandmother had one skillet and knew it so completely that she could cook anything in it. Bread, meat, vegetables, desserts, all in the same pan, sometimes in sequence, all in a single day. That's the real mystery hiding inside this story about onion economics. Your grandmother didn't choose the onion method because she was poor. She chose it because she understood something we've forgotten. One ingredient, cooked properly in a single tool, teaches you more about heat, time, and seasoning than a dozen recipes ever could. The onion wasn't a limitation, it was a curriculum. When you cook an onion in cast iron, you learn rhythm, low heat, patience, the moment when sweetness emerges from sulfur, how long it takes, and I mean truly takes, not the 20-minute version from modern cookbooks. We're talking 45 minutes to an hour, maybe longer depending on the size. During that time, the pan teaches you its hot spots, where it burns, where it caramelizes perfectly, which regions cool faster when you move it to a cooler part of the stove. By the third or fourth time you cook onions in that same skillet, you're no longer following a recipe. You're reading your pan. You know how much fat it needs. You recognize the sound of the sizzle. That means the temperature is exactly right. You understand without thinking about it, when to stir and when to leave it alone. That knowledge accumulates. It becomes muscle memory. Here's where many people misunderstand the economics of old-fashioned cooking. They assume the savings came from eating onions instead of expensive proteins. Partly true, but the real economy was in the skill you developed. Once you truly knew your pan, you stopped wasting food. You didn't overcook things. You didn't need replacement cookware because you understood maintenance. You seasoned as you cooked. You stored it correctly. Cast iron from 1840 lasted into the 1920s and then into the 1960s and sometimes into homes like yours today. That's not accident. That's the result of accumulated knowledge passed down. Now, before we continue deeper into this, I need you to think about something practical for a moment. If you have an old skillet at home, something that belonged to a parent or grandparent, something you inherited but maybe don't use much, this is the video that changes how you approach it, not by restoring it to some museum perfect shine, but by understanding why it matters to actually cook in it regularly, the same way your ancestors did. Because the pan's seasoning improves with use. The more you cook, the better it gets. That's not philosophy, that's chemistry. Pennsylvanian families understood this completely. They weren't cooking onions because they loved onions. They were cooking onions because the onion itself was almost irrelevant to the real lesson, which was mastery. Once you mastered heat in cast iron, you could cook anything: potatoes, dough, lard, and flour into crust, vegetables foraged from the garden, eggs, game when hunting season came around. The single onion method taught discipline too. You couldn't multitask. You couldn't start the onions and walk away to do something else. The whole point of that 45-minute investment was presence. You stayed in the kitchen. You tended the pan. You built a relationship with the temperature and the timing. That forced attention created competence, and competence created savings. Your grandmother also understood portion control through this method, though she wouldn't have called it that. When you cook one onion slowly, you're not trying to fill a pot. You're creating a small amount of deeply flavored ingredient that will stretch further in the final dish. Those caramelized onions, maybe a handful when cooked down, could flavor a bread soup, a meat stew, a potato dish. One onion, treated with respect, and time became 4 or 5 meals worth of flavor. That's not deprivation, that's knowledge. Knowledge like that doesn't survive by accident. It survives because somebody teaches it. Your grandmother didn't write down the onion method for you to find in a cookbook. She showed you. You watched her hands. You smelled the pan heating. You felt the kitchen grow warm around you both. And when you eventually stood at your own stove with your own cast iron, you already knew something true about cooking that no recipe card could have given you. This is where the real power of heritage cooking lives, not in the ingredients, but in the transfer of attention itself. Before we continue, hold on to something important here. The Pennsylvania Dutch families who relied on this method weren't doing it because they loved long cooking processes. They weren't romanticizing slow food 100 years before that term existed. They were doing it because they had to. The onion method worked. It saved money. It prevented waste. And once it worked, it became tradition. Once it became tradition, it became sacred. Your modern non-stick pan, by contrast, asks nothing of you. The surface is engineered to prevent sticking. The heat distributes evenly without your attention. You can walk away. You can multitask. That convenience comes at a cost, though most people never name it. The cost is the loss of that forced relationship with the tool and the temperature. You don't learn caramelization by feel anymore. You learn it by watching the clock or waiting for a visual cue that someone else engineered into the pan's design. The cast iron skillet never does that for you. It demands you pay attention. It demands you develop skill. In 1890, when a Pennsylvania Dutch farm family sat down to dinner, that single caramelized onion from the morning's work was already part of 3 or 4 dishes. The vegetable scraps from preparation had been saved. Carrot ends, celery leaves, onion skins, for stock. Nothing was wasted, nothing was accidental. Every choice reflected an understanding that resources were finite and that skill could stretch them further. A family with 5 children and a farmhand to feed couldn't afford to waste a single onion, so they didn't. They developed a method that turned one onion into a building block for multiple meals across the week. That method required one cast iron skillet, direct heat, and 45 minutes of presence. Modern grocery shopping has made this invisible. We buy onions by the pound. We buy them any season we want. We've forgotten that in 1890, onions were a stored crop. You had the ones that survived the root cellar from last fall's harvest. Once they were gone until next September. That constraint shaped cooking entirely. It shaped tools. It shaped methods. It shaped what people considered possible and impossible in a kitchen. Your cast iron skillet was the tool that made this system work. It heated reliably. It retained heat for the long, slow work of caramelizing. It didn't chip. It didn't warp. You could use it on direct flame. You could move it to a cooler part of the stovetop. You could even bury it in coals if you needed to. A single skillet could last a lifetime and then some. Most of the cast iron pans in use today in American kitchens were made between 1900 and 1930. They've outlived the people who bought them, the people who inherited them, and sometimes the people who inherited from those people. That's not coincidence. That's engineering born from necessity. When a tool is going to be the center of your cooking life for 60 years, it has to be built right. The reason your grandmother could make one onion stretch so far wasn't just technique, it was also tools. She trusted her cast iron completely. She knew it would perform the same way at 45 minutes in as it did at 5 minutes. She didn't have to second guess the heat or wonder if the bottom was sticking. The relationship between her hand, the temperature, and the pan's response was stable enough to become automatic. That automation of skill, that's what you need to reclaim. Not the poverty, not the constraints, the skill, the knowledge that your tools can be trusted completely, the understanding that your attention, applied consistently, creates real results. Your grandmother saved that family $100 a year. which for a family living on a farm in 1906 wasn't trivial. It was the difference between owning shoes and going without. It was the difference between having flour for bread or stretching cornmeal further. But she saved it through knowledge, not through suffering. She enjoyed caramelizing that onion. She knew she was creating something. She knew what it would become. That enjoyment, that presence in the work, that's the thing that modernity has tried to remove from cooking. And your cast iron won't let it be removed. Every time you use it, it asks you to be present. It asks you to develop judgment. It asks you to remember that you are the tool's equal partner, not its servant and not its master. It's a different relationship from what modern cookware teaches you to expect. And once you've spent enough time with cast iron, really spent time, really paid attention, you'll understand why your grandmother's generation wouldn't trade it for anything. That partnership I'm describing, it starts the moment you pick up the pan. Your hands learn to read temperature through the handle. Your nose learns to detect the exact moment a fat has reached smoking point. Your ear catches the subtle shift in sizzle that tells you protein is developing a crust. Modern nonstick teaches you to ignore all of that. Cast iron demands you pay attention to every signal. My grandfather kept a small leather notebook. Nothing fancy. He'd jot down observations about each skillet in his collection. Which ones held heat longest? Which ones browned biscuits more evenly on the bottom shelf of the oven versus the top? He wasn't being sentimental. He was being practical. He understood that each pan had its own personality, its own quirks, and that mastering those quirks made the difference between food that was merely edible and food that people remembered. That knowledge died with him because nobody asked him to write it down in a way they could actually use. His children wanted convenience. They wanted non-stick. They wanted the promise that a pan would do the thinking for them. And for a while, it seemed like a fair trade. Until people started noticing that food tasted different, that the joy had gone out of cooking, that a weeknight dinner felt like checking a box instead of creating something. Before we continue, I need you to grasp something important here. This isn't nostalgia talking. This is neuroscience. The human brain is built to engage with resistance. We are creatures who develop mastery through repetition and feedback. A pan that requires nothing from you doesn't teach you anything. A pan that responds to your choices, that demands adjustment, that punishes carelessness and rewards attention. That pan changes how your mind works in the kitchen. Your grandmother's onion method worked because it engaged her in that way. She couldn't just dump the onion in and walk away. The pan wouldn't allow it. The onion would burn if she wasn't paying attention. It would stick if she wasn't adding fat at the right moment. It would fail to caramelize if she didn't understand that low heat and patience were the only tools that would get her there. Every single lesson in her recipe was embedded in the physical reality of how cast iron behaves. She wasn't following instructions written by a test kitchen 3 states away. She was having a conversation with the pan itself. That's what gets passed down, not the recipe card. The conversation, the relationship, the understanding that cooking is something you do with a tool, not something a tool does for you. The reason families spent less money on food wasn't because the onion itself cost less. It's because they understood how to extract maximum value from simple ingredients. A woman who could caramelize an onion could also stretch a roasted chicken across 4 meals. She could turn stale bread into something that tasted intentional. She could make a small amount of meat feed more people by knowing how to build flavor through technique, instead of relying on quantity. Cast iron was the technology that made all of that possible. And I don't mean technology in the way we use the word now. I mean it the way it's used in archaeology. A technology is simply a tool that extends human capability. A cast iron skillet extended a woman's capability to create flavor and nutrition from economical ingredients. It extended her ability to feed her family well on what she had, not on what she wished she had. Modern nonstick does the opposite. It assumes ingredients should speak for themselves. It removes the requirement for technique, and in removing the requirement for technique, it removes the possibility of mastery, which means it removes the possibility of real economy. Your grandmother's pan, the one you might have inherited, or the one you wish you had, wasn't just cookware. It was a record of choices. Every burn mark was a lesson learned. Every smooth spot was proof of 10,000 meals cooked with care. The seasoning on that pan was built up one layer at a time, the way knowledge is built. You can't rush it, you can't fake it, and once it's there, it's nearly impossible to destroy. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning. Your grandmother didn't save $100 a year because she was poor. She saved it because she understood something modern cooking has forgotten. The tool doesn't cook the meal, the cook does. The pan is just the place where technique becomes flavor. When you own a pan that demands your attention, when you have to learn its temperament the way you'd learn a person's moods, you become a better cook. Not because the pan is magic, but because you can't phone it in. You can't assume. You have to taste, adjust, watch. A single onion isn't humble in a cast iron skillet. It becomes a lesson in heat control, timing, and patience. Those three things are worth money, they're worth time, and they're worth passing down. Here's what modern kitchens have traded away: the understanding that cooking well isn't about having more tools or newer appliances. It's about having fewer tools and knowing them so deeply that you stop thinking about technique and start thinking about flavor. That's mastery. That's economy. That's the inheritance worth protecting. The pan your grandmother held wasn't a kitchen object. It was a classroom. Every time she cooked, she was teaching. And if you're holding a cast iron skillet today, whether it's been in your family for 70 years or you picked it up last month, you're walking into that classroom every time you light the stove. That's not nostalgia, that's real. The onion method from 1806 still works because it teaches you something true. It teaches you that cheap ingredients, proper heat, and your own attention can create something that tastes expensive. It teaches you that the fastest way isn't always the best way, and it teaches you that the pan you own, really own, with your hands and your eyes and your experience, is never just a pan. It's a connection to your grandmother, to the kitchens before yours, to the kitchens that will come after. Your challenge this week is simple. Find a cast iron skillet, one you already own, or one you can borrow. Pick an ordinary ingredient, an onion, a potato, something your grandmother would have used. Cook it slowly. Don't rush it. Let the heat do the work. And pay attention to what changes, not just in the ingredient, but in you. That's where the real economy begins. That's where you become the cook your grandmother always knew you could be. The seasoning on a cast iron pan is a record of time. So is the knowledge it teaches. Thank you for spending this time with me, for letting me share what your grandmother already knew. Subscribe if you want to keep learning these forgotten skills, and turn on the notification bell so nothing gets missed. I'll see you next time.